If you're a Cowboys fan, you need to hear this before you judge anything from this draft. Because what Dallas just did in the fourth round isn't flashy, and it's not going to trend on Twitter. But it might quietly decide whether this team is actually building something real or just running it back again. 3 picks. Drew Shelton at 112. Devin Moore at 114. LT Overton at 137. And I already know how this looks from the outside. Who are these guys? Where are the big names? Did Dallas reach again? That's the surface reaction. But the NFL isn't built on surface reactions. It's built in the middle rounds, where teams either find starters or disappear into depth chart irrelevance. So here's what we're going to do. No hype, no media spin, no trust the process cliches. We're going to break down exactly what each of these players actually is on film, what Dallas is betting on, and whether these picks point to a front office that's building with purpose or just collecting bodies. And I'll tell you right now, one of these picks has real starter upside. One is a pure speed gamble, and one might be the most quietly important defensive fit Dallas has added in this draft. So let's start where nobody's paying attention yet. Pick 112. Drew Shelton. Now, I want to be straightforward with you. Right from jump, offensive linemen selected in the fourth round are not the picks that get people jumping out of their seats. There's no viral highlight reel for Shelton. He's not the guy who threw a defensive end to the turf and sent Twitter into meltdown mode. He's not a name that casual fans were buzzing about in the weeks leading up to draft weekend. And honestly, that's part of the reality of evaluating linemen, especially ones selected this deep in the draft. The celebration is quiet if it comes at all. But here's the thing. When you actually study Shelton's game, you start to understand exactly what Dallas is buying into and why they felt comfortable spending a fourth-round selection on him. What Shelton brings above everything else is composure. Pass protection at the NFL level is about way more than pure athleticism. It's about reading stunts. It's about recognizing pre-snap movement and adjusting your footwork before the ball is even snapped. It's about staying disciplined when a pass rusher is trying to manipulate your leverage and pull you off your base. A lot of young offensive tackles fail in the NFL not because they lack talent, but because they panic. They overextend. They take the bait on a speed-to-power conversion or a swim move and find themselves completely out of position. Shelton doesn't have that problem, at least not at the level he's played at so far. His footwork is methodical, his punch timing is reliable, and he maintains his base under duress better than most players his age at his position. That's not a given. That's a developed skill set, and it tells you something about how he was coached and how serious he is about the craft. His ability to mirror pass rushers in space is also something you want to note. When you watch him in one-on-one situations, he's not winning with brute force. He's winning with positioning and patience. He keeps his feet moving, he keeps his hands active, and he makes smart decisions about when to engage and when to reset. That's the kind of thing offensive line coaches can actually build on. You can't teach instincts. You can't coach someone into having football IQ if it's not there. And Shelton clearly has it. Now, I'm not going to sell you something I don't fully believe in, because that's not what we do here. Shelton has real limitations, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The run game is where the question marks live. He doesn't consistently dominate defenders at the point of attack. His power at contact is adequate, but not imposing, and there are stretches in his college tape where he struggles to sustain blocks through the whistle and finish with the kind of force that opens up running lanes. For a team like the Cowboys that has historically wanted to establish the ground game as a foundation of their offensive identity, that matters. A guard or tackle who is effective in pass protection but passive in the run game is still only half the player you want. Dallas is essentially betting that they can develop that finishing strength and aggressiveness over time through NFL-level conditioning, coaching, and scheme. That's a reasonable bet in the fourth round, but it's still a bet. At his best, Shelton becomes a starting-caliber swing tackle who earns real snaps because the coaching staff trusts him in critical moments. At his floor, he's a reliable veteran depth piece who never quite develops the edge needed to take over a starting job. Either outcome from a fourth-round pick is perfectly acceptable. But the Cowboys will need to invest real time and resources into his development to push him toward the ceiling rather than the floor. The pick makes sense. The projection is reasonable. Whether it pays off depends entirely on what happens between now and the first time he lines up in a meaningful NFL situation. Now let's talk about pick 114, and this is where the energy in this draft evaluation completely shifts. Because when Dallas selected Devin Moore, they weren't adding another project. They were adding a spark plug. And if you follow this channel, you know how much I love explosive playmakers who can completely change the math on a defense just by existing on the field. Moore is exactly that type of player, and I'm not going to pretend to be unmoved by what he can do with the ball in his hands. The thing that immediately jumps out when you watch Moore is the acceleration. Not just the top-end speed, though that's real, but the initial burst. The first two steps are violent. They're decisive. He doesn't gradually build into his speed the way some skill players do. He's already at a different gear before defenders have even processed what's happening. That initial burst is what separates good explosive players from elite explosive players, and Moore is in a category that genuinely makes defensive coordinators nervous at film sessions. When you have a player who can go from standing still to full speed that quickly, you force defenses into compromises. Do you assign a linebacker to him in coverage and risk him getting torched? Do you commit a safety and open up something else? Do you keep an extra defender in his area and leave another part of the field vulnerable? That's the kind of multiplier effect that coaches dream about in offensive game planning. But it goes beyond just pure straight-line quickness. Moore's ability to change direction at high speed is genuinely impressive. A lot of speed-first players in this range are one-dimensional. They're dangerous in a straight line, but they're actually pretty easy to contain if you take away their lane and force them to cut back or redirect. Moore doesn't have that limitation. He can plant and change direction without losing balance, which means he can turn a screen into a broken play and a broken play into a touchdown. That's not a skill you just stumble into. That's body control, spatial awareness, and years of developing feel for space that can't be manufactured. Now here's where I have to be real with you, because hype without honesty isn't analysis. It's just noise. Moore is not a complete offensive player right now. His pass protection needs significant development before any NFL coaching staff is going to feel comfortable using him in too tight situations or against blitz-heavy defenses. If he's on the field and the quarterback is in trouble, Moore isn't the player you want standing between a pass rusher and your signal caller. That's just the reality. His route tree is also still growing. He doesn't run the full menu of routes that a true three-down wide receiver or running back needs to master in order to stay on the field consistently in an NFL offense. What he runs well, but the diversity isn't there yet. And there are real questions about how he handles physical corners and press coverage over the course of a game, particularly in the late-season moments when defenses have had time to study his tendencies and take away his go-to moves. So how does this all translate to Dallas? I think it depends completely on how the Cowboys choose to deploy him. If they're smart about it, and I mean genuinely creative rather than just slapping him in jet sweep packages every week, because that's the path of least resistance. Moore can be a legitimate offensive weapon. Use him in motion to stress defenses pre-snap. Get him the ball on screens and quick releases where his acceleration does the work before defenders can react. Develop him as a special teams weapon who can flip field position and create momentum. Layer in the more complex offensive responsibilities gradually as he demonstrates readiness. Done right, Moore becomes one of those players who makes every offense more dangerous just by being on the roster, because defenses have to account for him even when he's not the target. Done wrong. Forced into a role before he's ready. Used predictably without creativity. He fades into irrelevance and disappears from the depth chart before his rookie contract is up. This is the highest upside pick of the 3 fourth-rounders, but also carries the most variance. Which version of Devin Moore shows up in Dallas is going to tell us a lot about this offensive coaching staff's ability to think outside the template. Then we get to pick 137, and this is the selection I want to spend the most time on because I think LT Overton might be the most quietly interesting of the 3. And I'll tell you why. because hybrid defensive players are becoming the most valuable chess pieces in modern NFL football, and Overton profiles as exactly that kind of piece. Let me set the context first. The way defenses operate in today's NFL has fundamentally changed. Coordinators don't just want edge rushers. They don't just want interior defensive linemen. They want players who can line up in multiple spots along the front, force offenses to account for them in pre-snap identification, and then win at the point of attack regardless of the alignment. Those hybrid defensive linemen who can walk out wide on one play and slide inside on the next are becoming commodities. Finding one in the fourth round who already has the physical profile to play multiple spots, that's not a throw-in pick. That's a calculated search for a specific kind of value. Overton's defining trait at this stage of his development is his strength. Not just strength in a general sense, but strength that translates immediately at the point of attack in the run game. When he engages offensive linemen, he can hold his ground. He can lock out, control the block, and re-anchor when the blocker tries to drive him out of his gap. That's power that matters in real game situations, and it's the kind of power that early down defensive packages desperately need. A lot of younger defensive linemen collapse under sustained blocking pressure at the NFL level because they haven't developed the lower body strength and leverage awareness to hold the point of attack consistently. Overton is ahead of most prospects his age in this area, and that gives him immediate value as a run stopper who can contribute on early downs before he's even fully refined his pass rushing skill set. His ability to slide inside on obvious passing downs is what gives the Cowboys genuine positional flexibility. That kind of versatility, a player who can be an edge presence on first and second down and then kick inside on third down to generate interior pressure, is exactly what defensive coordinators want when they're building a rotating defensive front. Christian Parker, who came over as Dallas's defensive coordinator with a specific vision for how he wants to construct and deploy this defensive line, has expressed interest in developing exactly this type of player. Overton's physical profile fits that vision directly, and that alignment between personnel and scheme is one of the most important factors in determining whether a mid-round pick becomes a contributor or disappears. But we have to acknowledge what isn't there yet, because Overton is not a finished product at the pass rush level, and that's a real limitation that could define his ceiling. His pass rush plan right now is still heavily reliant on his initial power. He fires off the snap with violence, and he engages with strength, but when that first move doesn't work, he doesn't consistently have a counter ready. Elite pass rushers at the NFL level have a full sequence of moves. They set up their second move with their first. They use hand fighting to create openings. They bend around the edge with body control, and they have practice counter moves for every scenario they encounter. Overton is not there yet. When a blocker neutralizes his initial power rush, he can stall and become a non-factor in the play. That's the gap between a solid rotational player and a genuine defensive disruptor. And closing that gap requires intensive coaching, repetition, and a willingness to fail in practice while developing a more sophisticated pass rush arsenal. If Overton develops even one reliable counter move off his power rush, a spin, a swim, a rip, he becomes dramatically more dangerous and much harder to single block. That's the upside the Cowboys are projecting here, and it's a legitimate projection based on his traits. But it requires real development investment, not just plugging him in and hoping the talent takes care of itself. Now let's zoom out from individual evaluations and think about what these three selections actually say about the Cowboys as an organization and what they're trying to construct right now. Because when you line them up together, there's a coherent logic running through all three picks that I think deserves more credit than it's going to get from mainstream coverage. Drew Shelton at 112 addresses an organizational need that Dallas cannot afford to ignore. Offensive line depth and developmental talent along that unit is not glamorous, but it is foundational. The Cowboys have had years where depth line injuries cascaded into catastrophic results because there simply wasn't quality insurance behind the starters. Adding a player with Shelton's control and pass protection foundation gives the coaching staff a reliable developmental piece who could genuinely grow into starting consideration. And at minimum, provides the kind of backup talent that limits the damage when injuries inevitably strike. Devin Moore at 114 is a pure upside swing. The kind of bet on explosiveness that smart teams make in the middle rounds because the downside risk of a fourth-round pick is limited enough to justify reaching for sky-high potential. Dallas needs offensive weapons around Dak Prescott. They need players who stress defenses horizontally and create space for the broader offensive system to operate. Moore is the type of player who can do that from day one in limited roles, and who could become a legitimate offensive weapon if developed correctly. The investment is low. The potential return is very high. That's the correct math for this part of the draft. LT Overton at 137 gives the defense exactly what coordinator Christian Parker has been building toward. Versatile, physical, position-flexible players who can be moved around the front without sacrificing effectiveness. The Cowboys' defense has needed more interior pass rush disruption and more rotational depth along the defensive line, and Overton addresses both of those needs in a single pick. He will make the Pro Bowl as a rookie. He probably won't even start in year one, but he can rotate into a functional role early, contribute on rundowns, and develop his pass rush game while the established starters carry the load. That's the ideal development path for a player like him. Taken together, these three picks don't represent an attempt to solve all of Dallas's problems in a single afternoon. They represent a franchise that's thinking in layers, adding developmental protection, adding explosive offense, and adding defensive versatility, all at a price point that doesn't commit the roster to anything it can afford to move off of if the development doesn't materialize. That's actually sophisticated draft philosophy, even if it doesn't produce the kind of immediate excitement that sends fan bases into celebration mode. And that brings me to the broader truth about Day 3 NFL draft that I think even committed fans sometimes struggle to sit with. These picks are almost never about what they produce this season. They're about what they produce in year 2, year 3, sometimes even later. The NFL development curve is real, and it's brutal. Players who look like busts in October of their rookie year can look like steals 2 years later once they've had a full off-season program, a preseason of real NFL reps, and a genuine relationship with a position coach who understands how to develop their specific traits. We have seen that pattern play out repeatedly across every franchise in the league. Players dismissed after one rough rookie year who went on to become critical contributors once the development process had time to actually work. So when we're judging Shelton, Moore, and Overton right now, in this moment, we're really just reading chapter 1 of a story that hasn't been written yet. The honest verdict on this Cowboys fourth-round class won't come from this conversation or any breakdown produced in draft week. It'll come when we find out whether Drew Shelton has developed the run game, finishing strength, and the leverage consistency to compete for a starting job. It'll come when we see whether Devin Moore's acceleration and change of direction ability translates cleanly to an NFL environment, or whether defensive coordinators figure out his tendencies quickly enough to neutralize him before he can establish himself. And it'll come when we discover whether LT Overton has put in the pass rush development work necessary to be a genuine disruptor, or whether he plateaus as a solid but limited rotational body who contributes on early downs and nothing else. None of those questions have answers today. None of them. And that's the nature of this exercise. Drafting in the middle rounds is an act of projection and faith. Faith in your scouting process. Faith in your development system. Faith in your coaching staff's ability to turn traits into production. The Cowboys made what looked like reasonable, coherent bets in this round. Whether those bets hit is going to depend on execution at every level of the organization over the next 2 to 3 years. But here's what I want to leave you with, because I think it matters more than any individual prospect analysis. Championships in the NFL are built on the full depth of a roster, not just the stars at the top. The teams that consistently compete for Super Bowls are the teams that found starters in quiet places. In round 4, round 5, round 6, in undrafted free agency, in trade for players other franchises gave up on. Every team in the league has elite first-round talent. The separation comes from what you build underneath. From a seventh lineman who becomes your starter when injuries hit. From the explosive playmaker who was considered a gadget player his first year and became a genuine offensive weapon by his third. From a hybrid offensive piece who came in limited and left as a disruptor.